Hello, I'm Alex. Welcome to my channel. Once again, I have another story for you. This one is about Gary Ridgway. This man, he is someone that's a bit under the radar as opposed to Dahmer or Gacy or any of those other ones that Netflix does so much coverage of. The reason why I say this is because he has done so much, 90 plus victims. So what I'll do is I'll start chronologically to the beginning and to the end and give some of my opinion along the way. So stay tuned. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah as the second of three boys. His father, Thomas Newton Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary Rita Ridgway, held a position as a sales clerk at JCPenney. The family later relocated to SeaTac, Washington in 1960. In SeaTac, Ridgway attended Chinook Junior High School and Tyee High School. Although he faced academic challenges and was held back 2 grades in high school, in the reports about him, he had little trouble fitting in socially. I'm sure you remember when you were in school. I know when I was, there were people that weren't doing the best academically, but socially they were doing great. They were the class clown on the playground. They were the ones connecting with everyone. Maybe it was just a situation in which he was delayed in his learning abilities. Other people during the time of grade school that knew him, they just said that he kind of blended in. He wasn't necessarily remarkable or standing out in any way, whether it be appearance or his personality. There were other reports that his home life was not a happy one. His parents punished him severely on countless occasions, even for the most irrational reasons, and he wetted the bed until he was 13, which shows a pathology that he's always on edge, that he's always feeling that they're going to think that he's doing something wrong. That may build up into an idea of a man who sees the world as an enemy. On top of all this, you would think that he would be experiencing enough insecurity. However, his older brother Gregory, he was living in his shadow as well because he excelled academically. He was pursuing a physics degree at a reputable college. His parents just favored him over Gary. And Gary, this just added to his insecurity and his buildup of his anger towards the world. And you would think it's even worse. He had to take an IQ test. It scored in the low 80s. And a lot of people that knew him, they knew that he was very upset about this. If anybody asked him about it, he just didn't want to have anything to do with that conversation. However, when it came to other things, he seemed to be all right. Unfortunately, in this boy's mind, there was darkness afoot. He was thinking about how to kill people, and he was thinking because he can't be intellectually successful, he was thinking maybe he'll become a serial killer. This seems like way off base, I know, but this is the kind of thought that he was having. And when he was later interviewed about this, he said that his perverse feeling towards his mother led to hatred. So he mixed his sexual perversion with violence. There were reports that his mother, Mary Rita, had touched him inappropriately when he was a child, in the sense that when he was being washed by her, she was doing it in the wrong way. However, Gary later doesn't really blame his mother. He said that he had a natural inclination to go this way anyway, and that he wouldn't blame his family for all of the atrocities that he would later commit. Although in his adolescence he didn't have any criminal record, there were some bad things that he was up to. And one time when he was 16, he had stabbed a young boy who was 6 years of age in the liver in the forest while he was walking around. So this is horrible. I'm sure if all the people that found out, they were horrified. But it didn't seem like he went to juvie for it. And then in addition to that, he was involved in arson and other things. And I'm not sure how he didn't have a criminal record, but it is pretty interesting why he wouldn't. Some people thought that Gary Ridgway, maybe he would grow out of it. He would just live a normal life and go about doing things that everybody else had been doing in society. Unfortunately, no, he didn't abate these dark desires, and he started to exercise them in the early 80s. So by this time, this was the start of his long career in serial killing, as he so put. In the summer of July 1982, the lifeless body of Ridgway's initially known victim was recovered from the Green River in the outskirts of Seattle. A disturbing sight greeted the investigators as they discovered a pair of blue jeans tightly tied around her neck. unbeknownst at the time, concealed within the denim used to strangle the 16-year-old runaway named Wendy Lee Cofield, were minuscule paint spheres. These tiny particles would remain unnoticed for over 2 decades. Shortly after the discovery of 4 additional bodies discarded in and near the Green River within a span of a month, the King County Sheriff took decisive action and formed a special task force. Their mission was to hunt down this serial killer. This predator, they didn't know at the time who it was. They didn't have really any leads. They were relentlessly targeting vulnerable women and young girls, many of whom were runaways or engaged in street prostitution. The killer left their victims' remains in isolated wooded areas. As the investigators diligently worked their way through the extensive case, they compiled a lengthy list of potential suspects and collected a vast amount of evidence from the dumping grounds. So despite the fact that they don't know who Gary is, they have a list of suspects. They're figuring, okay, who are the people that these prostitutes or runaways have been in contact with? However, Gary is remaining unnoticed virtually at this point. In 1983, Ridgway's name finally caught the attention of the task force when 18-year-old Marie Malvar vanished after accepting a ride from a man driving a pickup truck driving along Pacific Highway South. Later on, her boyfriend, who also served as her pimp, spotted what he believed to be the same truck parked in front of Ridgway's residence. So you would think that, hey, Gary, it's over for you. However, keep listening. Gary gave this whole spiel about, hey, he did solicit prostitutes and got in trouble for it before, but that no way is he involved in her disappearance. So basically, he was thinking, I'm not sure what was going on in his mind or how he thought this was a good idea, but Gary, he volunteered to give a polygraph test in order to clear his name. So he did it, and he passed. I'm not sure how he got his mindset in the right place in order to pass his polygraph. Some speculate that it was tested incorrectly, and that's how he was able to get out from underneath investigators. So after all this questioning, they pretty much dropped it and let him go. And in all these crimes that Gary is committing, he's leaving behind these paint spheres. Remember I mentioned before with his first kill? These were pieces that were crucial evidence to catch Gary and link him to the crimes. However, the forensic team, they were just going based off of hair fibers and clothing. They did not use that kind of state-of-the-art technology at that time. There were other forensic teams that were using it, but just not this particular one. A couple years later, Ridgway once again aroused suspicion when another woman reported an unsettling encounter. She described how a man who had shown her his Kensworth employee identification card attempted to strangle her after engaging in a paid encounter in 1982. So she kind of came back after a few years and said that, hey, this guy was trying to off me. Hey, can you do something about it? They didn't really seem like they did anything about it because she later dropped the charges. And yet again, Gary got away. During the same year, Palahniuk, a highly regarded expert in trace evidence, became aware of the case. At that time, he held the position of senior researcher at the renowned McCrone Research Institute based in Chicago, a leading institute in the field of microanalysis. Just imagine you have Palahniuk. He is a highly esteemed forensic scientist. He was holding workshops around the country. At this particular time, he was holding a workshop in the Seattle area, around, of course, where these murders are happening. George Ishii, who was the director of the forensic laboratory at the time, said that maybe he would use his expertise in solving this case. However, according to Palahniuk, George Ishii never took him up on that, never contacted him, and he ended up dying in 2013 due to age-related illness. Just imagine, you have the most highly esteemed forensic scientist in the country here, and you can potentially use him. He's at your disposal. But the director at the time, I'm not sure if he forgot or just didn't think it was important, or if it was an ego thing, he didn't take him up on the offer, so which is very sad considering there were many victims after this. By the year 1987, Ridgway's known association with prostitutes, previous encounters with victims, and various tips had provided enough grounds for investigators to obtain a search warrant of his residence, vehicles, and workplace. In their affidavit, The investigators stated that their intention to compare trace evidence collected from different dump sites, potentially linking Ridgway to their crimes, it was there. This evidence included green polyester carpet fibers and fragments of aluminum. However, upon seizing hair, fibers, clothing, and other items during the search, none of the evidence definitively linked Ridgway to any of the victims. So Ridgway, of course, way back when he tested with an IQ of low 80s, he was able to get under the radar of all of these investigators. And just imagine, there has been more than $15 million being spent by staff, investigators, just all of the havoc that is being run in this area, and he's getting away with it. And now we're in the 1990s, and unfortunately, there's another resurgence of bodies being found. And at this point, the Green River Killer Task Force, it was dissolved. However, there were some other investigators that kind of quietly created their own task force off to the side because they knew the killer was out there, that they needed to get this guy, and it was their responsibility. And this is where things are really sad. So in November 1992, the lab had some hair that was found on the victims that didn't belong to the victim, and they requested that the forensic lab compare this to Ridgway. They denied it. They said, forget about it. We're not even going to bother with it. Let it go. And unfortunately, that could have tied Ridgway to these crimes. It's just, they totally dropped the ball here, I just have to say. In spite of all this, you have a detective, Tom Jensen. He's very disconcerted with how things are going, and he knows that leads are starting to dry up because the killings are starting to wind down a bit. But he knows and he thinks that he is the one that needs to go at this head on, and that's what he did. And unfortunately, yet again, in 1998, the lifeless body of Patricia Yellow Robe was found. She was in the bushes next to a junkyard south of Seattle. A lot of people were saying that no, she was just overdosed and just died there. However, her sister went to the morgue and noticed she had bruises on her body. This is not consistent with getting an overdose. But the people working at the morgue were just saying, no, it's just her lifestyle. What she was doing, probably she just got bruised from before. But she wasn't buying it. Her sister wasn't buying it, so she raised hell about this. Very fortunately, Seattle, the investigators finally got their hands on some DNA state-of-the-art technology. So in 2001, they were able to finally link Gary Ridgway with all that evidence that they'd collected over the decades that's been over there in their little room. Detective Tom Jensen himself, he led the initiative and said, okay, let's get all this stuff tested right now. We're not going to be waiting any longer. Let's get this done. And of course, once they did all this testing, they were able to link Gary to these crimes. They did not use the hair fibers that they had from the last murders, it's a pity. Based on these results, Ridgway was apprehended and charged with the aggravated murders of all 3 victims, as well as an additional victim found near the other 2 in the river. Pleading not guilty, Ridgway's defense team argued that his DNA only indicated previous encounters with the victims, but not their killings. So at this point, Gary has been caught. But his defense team is saying, hey, I just like prostitutes. Yes, I have some of my DNA there, but it does not prove that I did anything. So now the trial was underway in 2002. Remember Palahniuk, that forensic expert from way back when? He was put on this task to look at these paint spheres that were in this evidence locker that no one even looked at before. Remember George Ishii, the director of the forensic lab back then, that totally shrugged him off? Well, now finally he can be utilized to pin the nail in the coffin for Gary Ridgway. The interesting thing about Palahniuk is he had his own company called Microtrace. Microtrace had been involved in high-profile cases like the Unabomber investigation and the Atlanta child murders. Over the following months, Microtrace analyzed paint samples collected from Ridgway's home, workplace, vehicles, and he established a reference library. These samples were then compared to paint fragments found at or near the dump sites where victims had been discovered. Even though he didn't find a match based on what he was doing here with these tests, he was able to do it a different way. So what he did is he used an infrared microscope that was able to find a particular type of paint. So this paint was used only by DuPont, and it was called Imron. According to chemists from the company, DuPont held a patent for this unique paint product, and they believed no other entity in the world produced paint with Imron's precise composition of pigments. And on top of this, this paint was not available to the public in 1982. It was only used by employees that worked with Kenworth. So this very, very specifically linked someone that was working for Kenworth to the crime, and that was Gary Ridgway. The defense team for Ridgway, they knew they were done. And they talked to Gary. They said, you need to do a plea deal if you want to avoid the death sentence. So they thought of something, and they ended up talking to the head prosecuting attorney. So in order for this plea deal to be made, they had a proposition that Ridgway would confess to as many killings as he could recall in King County and assist investigators in locating additional victims secretly in exchange for avoiding a death sentence. So you see in this picture, he's driving around, he's already been arrested at this point, and he's trying to remember where he had dumped all of his victims. Ridgway, while he was doing all this, he said that what he did was he would clip the fingernails of his victims because he would often scratch him, so that's how he got rid of some of the DNA. And that he did get paint on them, probably because he was working at Kenworth, and right after work he would go patrolling looking for his victims. And what he did is he basically would get rid of all the evidence that he could, but he did not expect that they would catch him in this way. Prosecutor Norm Malang stated that without the plea deal, more than 40 of Ridgway's murders would likely have remained unsolved. Among those victims were Yellow Robe, the last woman Ridgway claimed to remember killing. Gary Ridgway is now in his mid-70s. They suspect that he's in isolation because if he's in the general population, he would more likely be killed. So they figure that he's a risk to everyone else, and including other people at risk to him. Well, that's pretty much it for my narration of the story. In my opinion, it's very unfortunate that the investigators weren't able to catch him sooner. I feel like it was a little bit shoddy, the investigative work. I understand that the forensic team didn't really have all of the knowledge, but they did have all the evidence, and they did have Palahniuk, as I said, that could have been used. I figured, just think outside the box here. We have a killer. I mean, it's been more than 90 people here. It's a tragedy. I do appreciate you taking the time to watch my video. Be sure to like and subscribe below for more videos to come. And until then, I will see you on the next video.